Hello and welcome everyone to this special conversation. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, the chairperson of the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institution. We're having this conversation at the sidelines of the Takshashila Network for Advanced Studies conference, which is taking place in Bangalore. And it is my pleasure to host Anton Harder for this conversation. Anton is an international historian who works on China's international relations history. He is also currently finishing up a book on the India-China relationship in the early Cold War from 1949 to 1962. And we're going to be talking about how history in some ways lives today also. And there are echoes of history that exist even today in the India-China relationship. But before I get to that, Anton, welcome to this conversation.
Thank you, Manoj, for having me. And thank you, Takshashila, for having me to Bangalore. I've been having a wonderful time at the conference so far.
Awesome. So let's begin. This is something that I've always had I think I always tend to struggle with this when I look at the world today. A lot of what's happening today seems like unfinished business from decades ago. As much as we are moving forward, it still seems like there are these issues of the past, which perhaps frictions of the past, issues of the past, which perhaps had the lid put on them at the end of the Cold War in particular, because of unipolarity. And now, since the world order is changing, we seem to be seeing very dangerous whistles in that pressure cooker going off. And in that, that's the framing that I have of the world when I look at it today, and the series of conflicts that we seem to be having.
All the problems we have are left over by history,
in
right?
some ways, yes. So I wanted to sort of get to that, right? You're obviously doing the book on the India-China relationship in the early Cold War. I'm curious firstly, what's your primary thesis? What was the nature of that relationship at that point of time? In India, I think when we look at the past, particularly politically in the political discourse when we look at the past, there's a sense of looking at the Indian leadership that time and criticizing it as having been quite naive in how it dealt with China. How do you look at that relationship in the 1950s?
Yeah, I'm familiar with this is the popular perception of that period and Nehru's foreign policy perhaps more widely, right? Not only dealing with China. And it's not just a popular view. In a lot of the scholarship, there is also criticism of the Nehru era for, trusting China too much, sort of basing too much of the China policy in that period on a sort of idea of fostering friendship, which obviously, you can quite easily say that, well, that blew up in their face, right? Because of what happened. I mean, the war in 1962 didn't come completely out of the blue, of course. From 1959 was when relations really collapsed. So, and that account that there's a naivety there or over-trusting approach, or sometimes people talk, perhaps more in the scholarship, of an idealism behind Nehru's policy. That's not without some value and some, certainly some mileage. But I think that we can I would give Nehru more credit for the situation he inherited, right? He inherited, this is in 1947, a post-colonial situation, right? Yeah. And there's all sorts of contingencies, right? You've already gone through partition, or you've emerged into independence through partition. This is the trauma, right? It cannot be overemphasized. So I think that generation of Indian leaders, first of all, need to be given credit for holding course in that dreadful context, right? And actually doing a pretty good job of stabilizing India, setting out and perhaps you could criticize them in this way, perhaps overly ambitious project, economically, right? Sort of the planning regime that came in and the goals that were there on the economic front. But I don't think they had a choice. They had to be ambitious to deal with the conditions that they were in. So I think about foreign policy. I'm a historian of India and China's foreign policy in this period, not the economics. But I see them as entwined, right? Diplomacy had to serve the stabilization of India and then moving towards, developing India. The anti-colonial critique of the British was that they drained India, right? And now, if we're going to deliver, our legitimacy as post-colonial leaders is based on developing this country we've inherited, and diplomacy had to serve that. So there's a great deal of criticism in the literature and at a popular level about one of the big elements of Nehru's China policy was quickly making peace to an extent with the idea that we're not going to challenge China on Tibet. And Nehru made this point, that we're not going to send troops there. We can't do it. If they're really set on this, there's nothing we can really do. So I don't criticize him for that. But what I think Tibet is a huge issue in the 1950s for Sino-Indian relations. And the difficulty is that Nehru was never quite able to fully give up Tibet, and this sense that India has a special relationship with Tibet historically, culturally, for religious reasons, these cultural religious reasons. And this is one of the problems through the whole period up to 1962, that the Chinese were acutely aware of the fact that Nehru spoke of conceding Tibet, but at the same time, out at the other side they described him often as two-faced. That he talked about maintaining cultural relations, etc., and encouraging this kind of autonomous system that the Beijing did grant Tibet, actually, in the 1950s. They did try and rule Tibet in a different way to the rest of China. The Dalai Lama was kept in place. The theocracy, in a sense, was almost kept in place. So there was this, and to some extent, this is a concession to India, right? Indian sensibilities. But it doesn't work. Ultimately, for whatever reason, the Tibetans are unable to accept their condition entirely in being integrated into the PRC, and so the resistance that you get in the outlying regions grows through the 1950s and eventually in Lhasa as well, and the Dalai Lama flees. And the response in India really antagonizes China. This sympathy, this talk in India of a kind of nationalism, of Tibetan nationalism. And this is a national response in Tibet to China's integration. And this, for me, is one of the things that really upsets China-India relations. The border then comes in as well, but this narrative about what Tibet is, and there's no way, or it's very difficult to reconcile this if in India people, and there's a public discourse, the newspapers are banging on about this, right? That this is what we're seeing in Tibet is nationalism. This is unacceptable to Beijing to talk about, Tibetan nationalism. So profoundly provocative, and that points to the way in which I think I characterize the relationship between China and India in this period. As more than just a territorial dispute, which then turns into a short but pretty brutal war. It's a relationship that's entangled with ideas of what China and India are going to be in the post-colonial modern world, right? So if you're going to talk about Tibet as a nation, as a proto-nation or as a sub-nation, this profoundly clashes with China's sense of what we're going to be in this sort of post-imperial world.
So
right?
I'm going to just ask a little bit deeper on that. So what was the sense of the Chinese leadership at that time of what China must be? Must it be this leader of global revolution? Must it be an imperial power which is now going to return to its heights, say at the Qing dynasty, the heights of the Qing dynasty, or is it going to be a modern nation state which is going to make peace with whatever this new Westphalian or new iteration of the old Westphalian order is going to emerge?
It's a combination of those different things, but it's also at different times, those three things you mentioned, let's just repeat them. The sort of modern nation state acting within the new world of modern nation states, which is a new thing, right? The UN system, this is the post-imperial, the nation state is a fairly new thing. The other one, you mentioned, a leader of global revolution. Or a new imperial state, a reconstitution of the Qing Empire. So it's all of these things, but the emphasis is different. So there's an experiment, in my view, you know, the CCP, which took power in 1949 after, you know, decades actually of struggle, of course, was a revolutionary organization, and they took power, toppling the kind of comprador-aligned Kuomintang, the nationalists, and they, part of the CCP's legitimacy was that the national revolution is insufficient. The Kuomintang did that, but we also need social revolution to cement it. Imperialism has its allies within China, the kind of the compradors, the feudal classes, right? These are the people, the business people who have who do business with those imperialists, or the feudal landlords who fund, maybe invest in such things. So what I'm getting at is the revolution was part of what it will mean to be a modern nation state. And here's where we come to India, the frictions with India. That's a different definition of what a modern nation state will be. Modernity requires revolution, ultimately. Social revolution, not just a national revolution. India has only gone halfway, right? You've had and they respected the revolution, the kind of anti-colonial revolution the Indians had. But they said very clearly in 1949, when the PRC was founded, looking at India, it's job half done. Right? We look forward to the day. Actually, this was the message that Mao communicated to one of the sort of Indian communist leaders. I think it's Ranadive, B.T. Ranadive, saying, "We look forward to the day that India will join the, you know, India's 100 million, whatever the population then was, 400 million, will join the free peoples of the world." And actually, what was meant was, you know, you go to the next stage of revolution. So, at the same time, the idea of the territorial nationalism that existed is very much drawing on the Qing, right? So we will reincorporate Tibet into the People's Republic of China. Why exactly you know, they were so quick just to sort of fall back on the Qing, this is what we'll have to be? I suspect it's just because that's the atmosphere that those leaders of the CCP in 1949-50, that's the atmosphere they grew up in. The Kuomintang, the May 4th moment, you know, the 1919 into the 1920s, Sun Yat-sen, you know, the father of the republic, right? That was the idea he had, right? China, the Qing China will be China, or rather, modern China will be based on Qing China. So, do you see? I'm sort of suggesting these three things all overlap, but the difference is that Tibet will be integrated now through revolution. Our legitimacy is based on revolution, but they decided to pause in Tibet. First of all, we grant Tibet autonomy, and real autonomy, not like other minority areas where we're like, okay, we've got the autonomous county of the Dong in Guizhou and the, you know, whatever, the Korea. There was real autonomy granted in Tibet. And the Dalai Lama had a role in government. But the resistance ultimately that was there meant that Mao was already thinking this in 1956, 57, you know, this doesn't really work, you know, people just raise the banner of religion against us. I think maybe we need to shift to class struggle in Tibet. And ultimately, when the Dalai Lama ran away, that was the opportunity for Mao. I call it the application of counterinsurgency through class struggle, right? The monasteries are now dealt with, land reform is pursued. And that's how you're going to pacify Tibet. But then this leads to the problems with India.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to one of the things that you said earlier in your response was that, from the Chinese perspective, when they looked at the Indian leadership at that time, you said that they looked at the Indian leadership as two-faced in some ways, particularly on the issue of Tibet.
Yeah.
In Indian historical memory, obviously the idea of Chinese perfidy and the idea that the Chinese leadership was two-faced.
Yeah.
There's this famous movie in India around the war many decades ago, which has this scene where the Indian forces are down the mountains, the Chinese are high up, and they walk down saying Hindi chini bhai bhai, and then they go back and there's a discussion among Indian troops about, hey, look, do they really mean it? And then, in that sort of lulling them into a sense of comfort, suddenly there is this attack. So there is this, historical sense and mythology around Chinese perfidy in India. And what you seem to suggest is that at that point in time, even the Chinese leadership looked at the Indian leadership as essentially two-faced, as they can't be trusted. Was this sort of a structural issue which both sides just because you couldn't necessarily understand where each other was coming from, and therefore you read it as two-faced, or so was it a case of lack of strategic empathy, or was it a case of something more structural?
I think the idea that the Chinese were setting out to kind of deceive and lull India into a kind of complacency, and then we can deal with the border and things like that, is not quite right. I think that's sort of with hindsight, sort of in the that sense of betrayal that emerges in India, and this sense of hurt, colours there. I think I take pretty seriously the idea that China thought in the sort of post-Korea War, even actually earlier than that, during the Korean War, the Chinese shifted their approach to diplomacy. They sort of had they began in 1949 with the PRC as a sort of committed to revolutionary diplomacy. They're sort of thinking about, we've got to get troops on the sort of down in the south near the Vietnam to support Ho Chi Minh and what's going on there, and the same with the communists in the north of Korea. And then, of course, they go into Korea with the war. But the Korean War showed them that the Americans will fight, and are going to fight on our borders. And no one wins the Korean War. It's a stalemate, and a costly one. Although China draws advantages, it helps them consolidate through nationalism, actually, in Korea. Standing up to the Americans was good for business within China, politically speaking. It begins before the end of the Korean War, but really accelerates. And it's not just in Beijing, it's Moscow as well. The idea that, let's adapt our diplomacy. Let's sort of, rather than a strict adherence to, and of course Stalin has died as the Korean War ends, rather than a strict adherence to this two camps doctrine, right, that Zhdanov put forward in 1947 with the founding of the Cominform and the real emergence of the Cold War. Let's instead engage bourgeois nationalist Asia. Let's use the slogan of peaceful coexistence. And see if this serves us better strategically. And I just because that doesn't work out for China and they kind of abandon it and shift to a more confrontational approach, I think they're trying to give it a real go. Mao, I think there's a sincerity to this. Partly it's useful because it's opening relations with India is the way they do in a more sort of cooperative fashion. India helps China then, and Nehru's fully on board with this, sort of talk to Southeast Asia and persuade these countries, China isn't quite the threat that you think it is. Look, it's now committed to Panchil, as they then coin this, 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. You don't need to fear China. Therefore, you don't need to get into bed with the Americans in the way that the Americans are pressuring you to do. So, and then we see a deal at the Geneva conference where they partition Southeast Asia and people are attempting to kind of follow India to some extent in not exactly non-alignment, but we'll avoid getting too close to the Americans, and therefore keep the Chinese won't get too anxious. And Moscow is serious about this. Khrushchev in 1956, the famous, when he launches de-Stalinization, he also tries to, or he does, fix this new doctrine of peaceful coexistence, inserting it into Soviet doctrine, saying peaceful coexistence, peaceful competition, and peaceful transition. These are real things that we are now putting at the center of our diplomacy. Now, historians of the Sino-Soviet split debate when this really, the split really took place. But Mao is immediately uneasy with the idea that we will make an absolute commitment to peaceful coexistence. And why? Because his decades of political experience has shown him that those capitalist imperialists will never give up the fight.
Yeah.
So we would be extremely naive to say that we are, promise, Governor, we are now committed to peaceful coexistence. So Mao was a realist, and he thought Khrushchev was naive there. So that kind of, to me, I look at that as being a sort of a shadow that then passes over Sino-Indian relations. Because if you don't think that, if you're not going to, come what may, stick to peaceful coexistence with the kind of bourgeois nationalist world, then India might have a problem. Now, in my book, I make an argument that Mao, as we well know, certainly does turn away from moderation. You end up with the Cultural Revolution. But even in the 1950s, you get the Great Leap Forward, and you get him framing the 1962 war. One of the justifications given when he issues the order for attacking on the 20th, no, it's the 18th of October 1962. It's to stabilize the border, to bring the Indians back to talks, and it's to strike against the reactionaries, right? It has an ideological and a class struggle value. So there are various things that push Mao back into a radical direction, right? That prove to him that his unease with this idea of peaceful transition, peaceful competition, and peaceful coexistence with the capitalist, imperialist world, and therefore also with the nationalist, bourgeois world. There are various things that sort of start to confirm that sense that this is, we can be tactical about this, but this cannot be a long-term strategic fixed position. One of the major things that occurs is in Hungary in 1956. So this is 8 months after Khrushchev's announcement of these new doctrines. That soon, right, Mao sees the revolution that breaks out in Budapest, trying to, in his mind, overturn, well, he was trying to overturn the communist regime, right? And the Soviets have to go in and crush it. And Mao just sort of thinks, well, this has proved my point. The Americans, the imperialist capitalists are trying to overturn communism in Hungary. They will never give up, neither can we. But in the book, I argue, so I say that this is important for the way in which Mao looks at India, but I also say that Mao's sense that peaceful coexistence is naive is also fed by his observations of India. One of them we've already talked about, the way in which India responds to the Dalai Lama's flight, this sympathy for a feudal, theocratic, landlord-owning, monastic sort of figure. I mean, my God, if that doesn't show your real class allegiance, then what else could? But there's other things going on in India. The Indians, the Chinese, in the second half of the 1950s, are studying Indian economic policy and the politics of economics and economic policy in India very closely. And you see, if you look at these studies that are circulating in the foreign ministry from 1956, 57, 58, increasingly are looking at and explaining developments in India, and particularly the failures to deal with land reform in any serious way. And the Chinese just like, of course, because it's the class enemies throughout the Indian system which are obstructing this. Then there's one particular development which I almost have a whole chapter on this in my book, which I think you'll find interesting, is the experiment of communist government in Kerala, right? So the Communist Party of India wins the election down in Kerala, and they form an administration. Now, to me, I see this as, and I'd studied a lot about the Cold War before I came to my PhD, and it seems to me this is a great event in the history of global communism, right? You have an elected communist government at the height of the Cold War. So the Chinese immediately are watching this closely. And the ideological importance of this is, remember, what Khrushchev said just a short time earlier. Not only peaceful coexistence and peaceful competition with the West, peaceful transition. That a society can transition towards socialism without sort of the violence of class struggle, but we can use parliamentary methods. Now, along come the Indian Communist Party and win this election. They seem to confirm this. So the world watches closely, the Chinese in particular. And we know what happens. It fails. Nehru has to declare president's rule, and the communists are turfed out, and then I forget how many months after they hold an election, and the communists then lose that as well. But the Chinese read this as demonstrating the naivety of Khrushchev, and that Nehru is not as progressive as he claims to be. So this is one of the factors that feeds into this changing view of India in this period and contributes to the kind of that element. Of course, the Kerala, the dismissal of the government, it was almost in parallel with events with the Dalai Lama running away from. It's like the Dalai Lama leaves Lhasa in March 1959, and Kerala, it's finally resolved in about May or June. So these events happen in tandem, and I think are underappreciated. The Kerala thing is underappreciated in our sense of what's going on in China-India relations in this period.
That's fascinating. So there's a lot of thinking about, this ideological lens through which, and this class lens in some ways, and revolutionary lens through which they're looking at India within also this broader context of global revolution plays a significant role, which goes back to my first question, which was around which was the prism through which the Communist Party was looking at the world. My final bit to this conversation is I want to bring this conversation to the present times. Do you see parallels? Because what it also tells me is that at that point of time, there is clearly a lot of misreading of each other's intentions, objectives that's happening in the 50s in some ways. Do we see some parallels today about an ideological? Xi Jinping is, Kevin Rudd's written that book where he talks about the return of ideology. There's lots of talk about Xi Jinping being an ideological person. He talks a lot about, the return of ideology himself. Do you see some sort of parallels emerging from where we were in the 50s to today? Because once again, we're in a difficult relationship where there is engagement, but there is friction. We've just had a 5-odd-year freeze. We're now in the process of some sort of a defreeze of the relationship. That freeze 5 years ago in 2020 came after 2 informal summits between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping. At which point of time the optics seemed to suggest that things might stabilize between the two countries, and then you went into the pandemic, and then a border clash, 20 Indian soldiers dying, something that's not happened since 1967, So you're in a place where things are again there's a lot of question about each other's intentions, particularly after, those 2 informal summits seem to suggest that there is some degree of, if not bonhomie, appreciation of each other, and suddenly you were back to square one where you had 5 years of a freeze. So do you see some parallels from the past to today?
Yeah, I'm not so convinced by the ideological parallel in the sense that that's a similarity.
Yeah.
I think the ideological stakes were far... So if Kevin Rudd's right, and I'm not entirely sure I agree with his characterization of Xi Jinping as I think there's a lot of resources that are put into the ideological discourse in China, which to some extent is a kind of dressing up. It's not really, it doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel like the stakes count as much. Whereas in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, the Mao period, ideology really counted. There was more variation over time in the Mao period than I think sometimes we assume. It was this consistent ideological point. And I think I've already pointed to how it varied. In the mid-1950s, there's a kind of moderation. But it's not just China that had this sort of, China was really, just to continue on China for a moment and then I'll comment on India. In the 1950s and 60s, China's ideology, the stakes were so high. This was about defining human modernity, right? Are we going in down the dead end of American capitalism or anyone else's capitalism, or are we opening up a new world of freedom for mankind with socialism and ultimately communism, right? This really counted, and it was a real alternative, right? I don't think that's quite on offer.
But that is the argument that Xi Jinping is making today too. He says that we have coined Chinese-style modernization. We have given humanity a new pathway. He says that modernization is not westernization, and we have proved that, giving the developing world a new model. So in some ways, he is making that argument.
Yeah, but I don't see the Chinese pathway of modernization. Yes, not westernization. I don't see it as so different. I agree. I understand the point about modernization not being westernization, but it seems to me the end goal isn't so different from it's like capitalism with Chinese characteristics, if you like. I don't know, but it feels like it's not. The stakes aren't quite as high. I'm not saying there's no ideology at all. I'm not saying I can disagree with Kevin Rudd entirely, not at all. But in India, at the same time, back in the period, of my book, it seems to me there's also a kind of, India, of course, is experimenting with Soviet-style planning, but at the diplomatic and foreign policy, the global level, Nehru was an entrepreneur diplomatically, right? The non-alignment wasn't just a realist kind of ploy to give India time to invest in development, to avoid entanglements in the kind of American tradition. To me, it was bigger than that. There was an agenda there, or an ambition to demonstrate that first of all, that this is true independence, right? We will not bind ourselves. It would be beneath the dignity of an independent India to bind ourselves to an alliance that might then constrain us diplomatically. So yes, it's a post-colonial thing, but it's also a response to the Cold War as it emerges, that this idea of a binary division, that you have to choose and take sides, was repulsive, I think, to Nehru, morally. I think he saw Indian foreign policy, non-alignment, as a kind of moral exemplar, right? We don't need to accept this framing of the world. India, with all our civilizational and intellectual resources, we can come up with an alternative approach. And I think that's what non-alignment was. So it was also a kind of ideological contribution to the world and to humanity to say, look, this is another way of doing things. But of course, in the end, that comes to clash with Mao's revolutionary approach. So I think the ideological stakes were bigger. The ambitions were, more self-consciously ambitious back in that period. To me, it seems now nationalism dominates more. A Chinese model of development is definitely true. Of course, the Chinese have done things differently to say, America and Europe. But to some extent, they followed the South Korean and Japanese model, right, of state-led development. The question is, of course, now that the economic headwinds that China is facing, which are greater than they've had, in the last couple of decades, they've all the low-hanging fruit is in the basket. Now they kind of have the real challenge. So but she definitely seems to be doubling down on the idea of a Chinese model. So we're going to see, we'll see, you know, whether that will be able to steer them through this kind of this challenge of whether to transform or not and how to transform the economy. But yeah, I would say that those ideological stakes were far greater. That's what made the Cold War, was the ideology, you know?
Yeah. So final question. So do you see, I mean, given the fact that the ideological stakes are not as grave as they were in the 50s, yet there are new stakes, the geopolitical stakes, right, sort of, in some ways. Do you foresee this current effort that both sides are engaged in, India and China, to find some sort of a new equilibrium in the relationship? Is it going to require tremendous political will from both sides to achieve that? Or is there, given the kind of circumstances that we are in the world at large right now, does it sort of facilitate these two countries dealing with each other, finding some sort of common ground? Or is it like the world plus the sort of shift in terms of where both of them stand, structural fault lines, makes it much more challenging? Or was the 1950s much more difficult than this period?
Gosh, I mean, does the current maelstrom of international affairs somehow make more likely, or is there a sort of an interest on either, you know, does the current context drive them together? To me, it seems there are structural. So, you know, a year ago, people were sort of talking about China. Oh, there's this kind of thawing that's going on, which was pretty surprising in a way, given what had happened during, you know, with Galwan and things. You know, the shock that had given, I think, to the Indian system and society, perhaps at least. So I was quite surprised that suddenly there was this talk of, you know, things improving and, you know, Modi going to Tianjin and stuff like that. But one of the things that struck me was, so the border seems so intractable as a problem, you know, and it seems worse than it was back in the period where, you know, my expertise sits, right? You know, the Chinese seem very happy to offer a swap deal then. I know that, you know, sometimes that's used to paint the Indians as unreasonable, because it's like, well, you just hold what you've got and we'll hold what we've got. There are reasons that Indians couldn't really accept that then. But the problem now is that you've got the Chinese public are quite attached to the idea of Arunachal Pradesh, southern Tibet, as being something that actually, you know, this is something China should really control. So you've got the problem of Chinese public opinion, which didn't exist in the earlier period. Indian public opinion was a problem back in the earlier period, and I think it will remain a problem now as well. So this issue of the border, although there is huge incentive, I think, for India particularly, and I think China worries less about. I know that China worries less about India than vice versa. There's a basic asymmetry in China-India relations, which we haven't had time to talk about, but is a. But anyway, that structural thing in the border, I don't see as being solved, even though there are reasons why, you know, both would benefit from doing so, but their publics aren't going to let them do it. I also thought events in India-Pakistan relations this year underscored that problem as well, right? This is, I think, another major kind of structural issue. The confrontation after the attacks in Kashmir, and then the realization, I don't think in India's military elite, but perhaps in a societal level, you would know more about this than me, but my sense is that this brought home how intertwined, right, the Pakistani military is with China, and that adds to this, you know, sense on the Indian side of, you know, of Chinese hostility and entrenched hostility, and that there's this kind of fundamental clash. And I've been quite, not amazed, but struck at least by the way in which over the last year or two, and I've engaged quite sort of in a way that I hadn't done for some time with the contemporary China-India situation and the way in which Indians are thinking about China as a contemporary issue, this default assumption of malevolence on China's part, which seems to permeate many levels, not just society, those people who read the newspapers and things like that, but also amongst people actually thinking about China quite hard. That this is a power that is actively hostile to India's interests, and that's going to take some work on China's part to kind of soften that image. But I'm not really sure that China's that bothered about this. China has other fish to fry at the moment. And this comes to the asymmetry. China's concern is the US. Yeah. It isn't India. Yeah. So, perhaps that means the onus is on India to do something more if they want to stabilize this relationship, build on the progress that has been made, but I think it's very limited and very fragile.
All right. Anton, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I think some of this is really, really interesting, particularly views that you've shared with regard to the nature of ideology and the role that it played in the 50s leading up to the 1962 war. Plus, I think the point about Chinese public opinion today, particularly with regard to Arunachal Pradesh and broadly with regard to sort of territorial issues and how that's changed, because I think that is something that we in India need to understand much better also. I remember when I used to live in China, this was pre-Xi Jinping era also, there was very little talk about the 1962 war in China. Yeah. I don't think there was any public memory. No. In India, on the flip side, obviously there's a deep public memory. I fear that even in China now, the 1962 war is now becoming part of public consciousness, right, at least when I engage with people. So there is a change that's happening, and I think that it's something that we also must engage with. And to do both of those things, I think you need to be talking to each other a lot more too. Anton, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Manoj.
Thank you.